We want to take some time out to talk about fraud. And it's a major topic. And I'll just share with you right up front what I found in my experiences personally and dealing with consulting and evaluating offices. And I'm going to share with you 15 common types of insurance fraud. Um, and what are the violations? What may result? So, and how to prevent it. So, and I'll share with you 5 kinds of fraud right now that you're probably doing, but you don't even know it. And a lot of times that is the case. You don't even know it until something happens and then you get caught up into it. So this is a big deal. So first of all, you need to be aware when we're talking about fraud, we're talking about 3 different types of penalties. There's what's called the administrative penalty. Who's that? That's your state board. And administrative penalties is your state board. And of course, they can fine you. They can do a license probation, license revocation. Then there's civil penalties. And that happens more frequently than what you realize. And those are fines. And then there's criminal penalties. And usually when you're talking about fraud, you're dealing with all 3 of them. You're dealing with administrative, civil, and criminal. Now, I happen to know a lot about this because I was falsely accused of insurance fraud by one of my employees. Matter of fact, it was the largest chiropractic complaint recorded. So this guy was real frustrated. We bought his practice. He didn't do very well, and we tripled it in 90 days. He wanted it back. I said no. And so he filed this massive 18-page fraud allegation. Well, the bottom line is I'm the only chiropractor that beat the United States government in fraud. So I was not guilty of fraud, but it took 4 years of my life and I lost $22 million. So it can be a real problem. And by the way, he was also hired as my compliance officer. So let that sink in a little bit. So I had to deal with administrative. I had to deal with the board. I had to deal with civil attorneys. I had to deal with criminal attorneys. So I had, at one point in time, I had 17 different attorneys. My legal bills were over $100,000 a month. So we know something about how this works. So let me walk through the different types of fraud, and I'll share with you the most common fraud you're probably doing right now, but you don't know it. But you'll find out that that's no excuse. When you're caught, there's no excuse for what you don't know. So let's walk through. Some of them are real obvious, like bill for services you did not perform. Well, that's an obvious fraud. Or bill for patients you did not see. And that's what most people think of when they think fraud. And bottom line, if you're doing that, that's not an accident. That's a purposeful fraud. And I'll just tell you, the people that'll turn you in are the ones. It's your office managers. It's your employees are the ones that are going to turn you in, and they know everything that's going on. I know one of my instructors back at chiropractic college. He was sent to jail for 6 years for billing for x-rays. He was a big personal injury doctor, and he was billing for x-rays that he did not take. And I don't remember, I think it was a simple audit. That is how, and a lot of times this is how it gets started, is a simple audit, and then that audit leads to a bigger audit, and think that's kind of how it unfolds, or a disgruntled employee. So anyway, his office manager knew, for whatever reason, his office manager knew he was doing these services, billing for him without doing the services. So she squealed, big time, because she didn't want to go to jail, and they were good friends. Well, their friendship didn't matter. She didn't want to go to jail. So anyway, I don't remember what the total fee was, but it was thousands of dollars. But it was overt also. It was overt. It wasn't an accident that he, accidentally billed for service every now and then that he didn't do. That's not what happened. He was routinely billing for x-rays that he didn't take. So there you go. He went to jail. So these are real obvious ones: services you didn't perform, bill for patients you did not see. So those are obviously no-nos. Those are the two big ones. Now, there's also treatment frequency fraud. Treatment frequency fraud. Well, what is that? And this is a common one that doctors are doing that they don't realize it. And treatment frequency fraud is when you treat the insurance patient, like the personal injury patient, differently than you do your major medical or your cash patients. Treatment. I remember I had a doctor. He was a client of mine. We were doing an evaluation, and we were looking at his patient retention and his treatment recommendation. He was seeing patients right off the bat at twice a week, and I'm like, well, that's unusual. Why are you doing that? Well, I looked at his statistics more, and it turns out there was a group of people that he would see 3 times a week. Well, guess who that group of people was? They were personal injury patients. So every personal injury patient he was seeing 3 times a week when they got started for care, and all the rest of the patients, major medical and cash, he was seeing twice a week. It was so blatantly obvious. Well, that's fraud. That is just absolute treatment frequency fraud based on payment source. And that happens a lot. And I see chiropractors do that a lot. They'll give higher intensity frequency treatments for the PI patient and not for the cash or major medical patient. That's a real problem. Now there's treatment amount fraud, and I see that a lot. That's a very common problem with chiropractic. In other words, the cash patient will get, 1 therapy and the PI patient will get 3, something like that. So that's very common, and it's very easy to find out. Remember, all of this is documented. Everything you bill goes into the insurance company. It's in stone. They've got it. And they can subpoena anything. Once you're under the gun, they can subpoena anything. Don't get those records. So, and I'll go into some solutions that I would suggest and how I handled it and what you might want to consider. But I see that often: frequency fraud and treatment fraud. Fee structure fraud, same thing. If you have different fee structure for, say, the personal injury patient versus the cash patient, I see that a lot. That's fraud. You can't do that. You have to charge the same. And I'll share with you how to, my suggestion to do it legally to where it's not fraud. Do all this stuff legally to where it's not fraud. So short the time required for a coded service. That these coded services, whether they are for passive therapy or active therapies, have certain time frames, and the times are not documented, or not the full time is allocated for the billing service. I remember I looked at one client's therapies that he was doing, and he had his regular adjustment, and I think he had 3 active therapies, and they were all full. They weren't modified active therapies. They were full active therapies. So you're talking 15 minutes. And that patient would have had to been in that, when I looked at him, I go, that patient would have had to been in that office for almost 2 hours per visit. And the patient wasn't. I said, you got a problem here. You definitely have a problem here. You're billing for time that you're not doing. And then, the other problem is, if you're going to keep a patient for 2 hours, you're going to lose a lot of patients too, So that's short time required for the coded service. So now one of the things about that, though, is if it's a 15-minute, it doesn't mean that they get the therapy for the full 15 minutes. That's not what that time is. It's for the diagnostic, the interpretation, and the documentation is for the full 15 minutes. So it's not like they have to be on the therapy, point A to point B, 15 minutes, okay? But, and this is why some doctors will even time it. They'll time these and write the time on it just to prevent that fraud from happening, to make sure that they're abiding by the time codes. Bill for higher coded service than you delivered. This is somewhat common. You may see it in examinations. Doctors will charge for a higher exam fee, but they didn't do the service. They'll maybe do a lower end of the, there's roughly 5 different examinations. And instead of doing the higher examination, they'll do the lower, but bill for the higher. No, there's certain things that have to be done with each of those codes, or it's fraud. So I see that happen a lot. Doctors just kind of ignorant to that, or they don't know, what are the components that are necessary to be billed for that examination fee, the higher examination fee. And yet they'll still do their cash patient examination. See, that's fraud. See, and that's very easy to evaluate. Remember, everything you do is written down. It's especially if you're documenting in a computer. You can't change that. The forensics will go in there and find out even if you did change it and when you changed it. So payment types. So let's say bill for higher code of service. That's what we just talked about. Payment type preference fraud. Payment type preference. That's again when you're treating cash patients differently than personal injury patients, and I see that a lot. You'll see the chiropractor, the cash PI patient comes in and he gets, he gets 3 or 4 therapies and he's 3 times a week, and cash patient comes in and he gets 1 therapy and he's twice a week, something like that. Payment type preference fraud. That is just bad news. That's what they'll try to do. Attorney kickback. I actually had two clients admit to me they were doing this. They didn't realize, that it was illegal when they told me, but basically what they did is they just paid the attorney back. And I tell you, that's bad right there. Attorney kickback. That's real. That's when you start losing your license, when you start getting involved in stuff like that. And sometimes these attorneys will push you, they'll push you, give me a little X and I'll refer you. And now you're talking about your license on the line there is what you're talking about. There's nothing good that's going to come out of that. There's absolutely nothing good about that. And usually that's doctors who don't know how to get business, don't know what they're doing in business. They're suffering in business. Those are usually the doctors that resort to those types of things. Paying for referrals. I had clients admit that they hired a marketing person and they paid him $500 for every referral. Well, you can't do that. You can't do that. That's fraud. I was talking to, matter of fact, there's somebody in this group I was talking to, and that's what they did. They were paying somebody, hired somebody, and they were paying them a certain amount for referrals. And I said, you can't do that. That's fraud. See, now when you're outside of the healthcare world, you can do stuff like that. If you're selling widgets or pipes for plumbing and stuff like that, you can give kickbacks and referral fees and all that. You can't do that in healthcare. So paying for referrals, and that's what they did. They were just paying somebody who said, hey, I can get you X amount of referrals from attorneys, and you don't know what they're doing. You don't know if that person's even given a kickback to that attorney. See, you don't even know how deep that goes. So that's bad news. That's just bad news. Changing records after the fact. That's bad news. That's fraud. Especially with everything now that's digital. It's recorded when you did type it in, when you didn't type. A forensic audit will find all of this stuff. All of it. When was it put in? All that stuff. Changing records. Again, I can go into solutions, and I probably will go into solutions to all this on how to handle these, but these are things you want to stay away from. Not document the SOAP note on each visit. I'd say 9 out of 10 chiropractors don't do that. They don't document what is considered by Medicare the minimum standards of documentation. not documented soap note on each visit. I can't tell you how many doctors just don't even document soap notes. They'll just maybe do re-exams and that's it. Not documenting 2 evaluation and management codes during the routine visit. Probably the number one fraud that I see doctors doing accidentally is in the soap note. For the objective portion, you're supposed to have 2 evaluation and management codes. 2. And routinely, I see doctors who don't have that at all. They don't have it at all. That's fraud. Now, what does that mean? It means you did not have the documentation necessary to support your fee. So what does that mean? It means it's real easy for the insurance company to pull your files, see that you don't have the 2 E&Ms, and guess what? You have to pay them back. For every visit that you do not have supported documentation, you have to pay them back. And they'll get their money because a lot of times what they'll do is they'll just stop paying you. You know, they'll just keep offer their money. So they will get their money. Paying them personally for their transportation. I had a doctor call me one time and he was freaking out. He was being charged for fraud. And why? It's because he was giving transportation tokens to his patients. Well, you can't give the patient the money directly. So you can pay for the transportation. That's what's so great about Uber now, is you just have an Uber account and the Uber pays for it. And by the way, it's totally legal to pay as part of their care, their transportation. And it's even allowed for to charge a little bit more for administrative fees. But it's not supposed to be a profit center. So, you know, if you're using it, you could just use Uber to send them in, collect it, put it to the bill. You can even add a small administrative fee for it because somebody had to put that together. Somebody had to do it. See? But this person was handing them, you know, like bus tokens, bus tokens, money. And so he was getting charged with fraud. So I helped him out in that situation. Billing for a non-documented complaint. That's somewhat common. Patient comes in and maybe they'll have neck and mid-back problem, and then the doctor won't document. That's all they'll document is the neck and the mid-back. But then he'll bill for 3 areas of adjustment. Maybe he'll bill for the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar, where there's no documentation. There's no chief complaint. There's no documentation. There's nothing. And that's fraud. That's how fast it goes. So having said that, let me go into the 5 most common frauds that I see when evaluating offices. And again, these are mostly the doctors just don't even know they're committing the fraud. One was the soap notes I was talking about, not having 2 evaluation and management codes. I can't tell you how many offices I run into when I do practice evaluations. I'd say easily 8 out of 10 offices do not have 2 evaluation codes in the soap notes for a regular visit. In other words, they could ask for all that money back, all of it, all those visits, all that money back. And it happens. I'm surprised it doesn't happen more than what it does because how bad a lot of these notes are. Paying the patient for transportation, not the service. I've talked about that. In other words, giving them tokens like the bus or taxi. So you would pay the taxi service. See, you'd pay the Uber, stuff like that. Unnecessary treatment, not documented or supported by periodic testing and not quantifying. And that's real common. We see a lot of doctors who are bad at documentation and they just treat. They just keep treating, until finally the insurance company puts a halt on it and sends them to the IME to stop it. That's the classic doctor who doesn't know what he's doing, doesn't have a good business. I see a large percentage of chiropractors, and I say they try to get rich on one patient. That's what I said. That's what I call it. And those are essentially chiropractors that don't know how to get business. They don't know how to get or keep business. And so when they do get a infrequent PI patient, they bill the hell out of them in all the different ways. So unnecessary treatment, not documented. So even if they have the problem, you don't have the proper documentation, that's fraud, whether it's in the examination, re-examination, or the daily, the daily visit with the soap note. That's fraud. So, and this is not complicated stuff. I mean, chiropractors only typically use a bill for two examination procedures out of roughly five. And the soap notes aren't that complicated. When you break it down, they're really not. And then the chiropractor typically only uses what, 20 diagnoses and maybe 5 therapy codes. That's it. So this is not rocket science. This is not complicated, but for some reason, chiropractors complicate the hell out of it. Paying a marketer for referrals, that was the one that I told you. I've seen that. They're paying somebody else for referrals, and if you get X amount of referrals for X amount of money, and well, that alone's illegal. But then now you don't know how much is that guy paying. What kind of kickback is that guy paying to the attorney? Is he giving half of it to the attorney? See, now you're in a real, you're going to be on the front of the news, uh, your local news station that night. And then, of course, the fee structure fraud, um, when you're constantly billing more for PI patients than cash patients or insurance patients. So there's a lot of fraud going on out there. Most of it's not known. Most of it's not just, it's not doctors trying to deceive. The real deception fraud is billing for services you didn't do and billing for patients you didn't see. That's the big fraud. But all these other types of fraud will get you into trouble. And you go, well, what will determine when it will be charged? Well, it's their choice. So how does this typically come along? How does this fraud typically get out? Well, typically, disgruntled an employee will file a complaint on you if they know something, or they'll ask for a small sample of your records. And then they'll compare your records and they'll see like some of these points that I just pointed out, like not having 2 E&Ms on a soap note. And then, maybe they only requested 1 file or 5 files. And then they evaluate it and they see, well, wait a minute, there's problems here. And then next thing you know, they're requesting, all your files for that particular insurance or something like that. And that's when it's going downhill fast. That's when you're in big trouble fast. But that's typically how it starts, a disgruntled employee or having one of your files. That's why you just don't want to randomly send in files. I mean, when they want notes, you want to know very specifically what they want, as narrow to detailed as possible, and only send those. That's it. Because it's like a fishing expedition. They start seeing anything else, that's totally reason enough for them. And there's a lot. Unfortunately, it's like I said, I go into 8 out of 10 chiropractic offices and they're committing fraud and don't even know it in one of these categories. So, what will determine if you will be charged? Well, it's up to them, but generally, the more money that's involved, that's going to be a big deal, and the more people involved. So generally, if you're what's considered a small fish, they don't fool with you. But if you're talking about a lot of money, if you're doing a lot of money, you're doing $1 million. In other words, you're way over the actuarial scale of a chiropractor. So, say the average chiropractor sees 107 visits, makes X amount of money, and they look at your billing, and you're doing $1 million a year. Well, you better make sure you've got all your T's crossed and your I's dotted. So that's one of the ways they'll look at you. So go, wait a minute, this person's way out of line compared. What are they doing? That's what they'll do. So you just got to make sure you got all this done when you're a high performer. So the more money that's involved, you'll be looked at. The more people that's involved. So if you're involving a lot, like I said, you got multiple offices. They see a little bit of fraud here, but they see you got several offices, and that's like there's one group in here. They're not. There's a group here that's not legally together, but they brand themselves together. And little do they know that they're going to be tied together when it comes to fraud. So And that's why I said when I was talking to one of the guys that was kind of the leader, I said, there's no way I would want anybody in this group unless they went by this checklist, because I'm going to be going down with them. The person who doesn't do it, yet we're all under the same name, this personal injury name, you're going to get brought right into it because this other person did, billed for services he didn't do or didn't have the right documentation. Well, that alone is enough to go through all the doctors in that group and get all your records subpoenaed. That's another reason I wouldn't do it, unless there were qualifications. You had to do A, B, C, and D. And then there was structure involved. In other words, you want to protect yourself. Okay, so how to protect yourself. Number one, HIPAA office policy book. It is required by HIPAA that you have an office policy book manual, number one. Number two, in there, I always put in our employee manuals that we're against fraud and all this, but I put in there that if the employee at any time suspects any type of fraud, it is there to immediately bring it to our attention. So in other words, we're going out of our way to say, hey, there can be mistakes here. And if they are, we want to know as fast as possible so we can correct them. And statistical evaluations. So it's real easy to detect fraud with statistical evaluations. And I'll just share with you what happened with me. Is one of the fraud allegations they made with me is that all the personal injury patients were getting the same types of service, getting the same recommendations. I knew that was a lie. Well, they made a huge mistake. This was the Department of Justice, and this was in trial. So they actually had people testify that I taught that all the PI patients got one set of recommendations and all the other ones didn't. I couldn't believe my ears when I actually heard it. I was astonished because I knew it wasn't true, but it didn't matter. When they want to come after you, they just come after you with whatever they want. Well, that at the end of that day in the trial, I went down and I took a sample box and I did the math. I calculated it out, how many PI patients, how many Medicare patients, how many cash patients, all that. And then I listed their recommendations and they were all different. And then we brought it back the next day and said, hey, you just testified that they were, all the PI people get this and all the other people get that. And well, that's not real. Here's the box and shows that here's the PI patients are getting the same as the cash and the major medical, okay, by far and large. Well, that really hurt them. Well, of course, they lied in the first place. So they go down and they do a forensic accounting that night of all my files. They had 10 years of all my files. I'm talking about a lot of boxes, 3 pallets of boxes stacked 10 feet high. So they went through all of them. So they stayed up all night with their accounting, came back the next day, and I was 1% off. That really hurt them. So they tried to say something fraudulent about me without this is the United States government. They purposely tried to say something that I was doing fraudulently without having the knowledge, and they got kicked. They got kicked. It looked really bad when I came back and showed the statistics. And of course, I'm the only chiropractor who's beat the United States government in trial by a court of law, being accused of fraud. I'm the only chiropractor that's beat the US government. So I know a lot about this. I know how they work. So HIPAA, that's statistical evaluations. So it's real easy to look at statistics from afar and see what you're doing, compare your statistics, whether they're far out, the percentages, the ratios of norms and all that. Proper signatures on proper documents. Agree to pay, hardship agreement, time of service discount. And then I recommend to have a compliance officer consult.